very recently I crossed over the 15,000 subscriber mark. And small in terms of YouTube numbers, I know, but for me, a very important milestone. Now, I've been thinking for a little while what to have as my 15,000 subscriber special. I did have a couple of ideas that unfortunately went by the wayside, and then pretty much yesterday, if not the day before, my friend and fellow Lotus enthusiast Charlie got in touch, and we've been talking about doing a video together for quite some time. Charlie has his own little YouTube channel as well called Charlie Drives. I'll put a link to that in the description below. But I've been pestering him for an awful long time to have a go of his car. And with this being a 15,000 subscriber special and the channel now on its 2-year anniversary, more or less, as we started with Lotus, I thought it'd be nice to do something a bit Lotusy. And so today I'm behind the wheel of what I still consider a dream car, a Lotus Esprit. Now, Charlie's car is a 1994 S4 high wing. Now, I need to stop myself there very, very quickly. I'm sure you all think that because I spend all this time making Lotus content and driving things around that I know everything about them. Well, that simply isn't the case. And when it comes to the older models, things like the Esprit in particular, my knowledge isn't exactly brilliant. I thought this model was a high wing because it has the wing mounted kind of halfway up the spoiler and the later cars don't. It turns out the car that's correctly called the high wing is a version of the Esprit SE that came a couple of years before this car. So I make the mistake of calling it a high wing a couple of times in the video. I hope you can all forgive me. Thanks. It's called the high wing for pretty obvious reasons. I think the high wing look really divides opinion. Personally, I like the later S4S and V8 style wing, which most people do. I think, are you planning to put that wing on as well? And Charlie's planning to change this car to do that as well. Now, this car is very, very nice for a couple of reasons. The main one is that it's been used. I have driven an Esprit once before. It was one of the earliest videos that I ever did, so the technical presentation was somewhat lacking, but basically I was driving a V8 Esprit. Now, that car was in absolutely pristine condition, and I was driving it on somewhat unfamiliar roads with tight speed limits. Basically, I was driving it on the outskirts of London, and it was a great experience. It was lovely to have done it and been given the opportunity, and Brooke, if you're watching, thank you so much for that. That was an amazing car, but I don't think I really got the feel for it. However, I'm now on roads that I know in a car which has been enjoyed somewhat more, so I'm a bit more relaxed about the whole thing. Now, first thing you notice when getting in an Esprit, which hopefully this little camera back here will be picking up, is the driving position. It's quite weird. Even as a multiple Lotus owner, it's pretty alien. So the car's design can be traced back to the original Esprit, which you have to remember is a product of the 70s. So the weirdest place to be actually is the passenger side, because you have this front here, this way basically you've got a little bit of a storage bin. This just juts right out because the car's frame goes along here. Then on this side, this car still has a version of the very early sort of space age style instrument pod, which kind of really surrounds you. It's very nice. I like a really driver focused interior, and this is definitely that. The car feels a mile wide. It feels absolutely massive. It also gets a lot of attention, which it should, because they still look awesome. And this car has a sunroof, which we've only got sort of partially cracked open at the minute, so the sound is a little bit better. And as you can see today, the weather is glorious. Got people out having picnics and doing stuff, and it's just a lovely, lovely day, really. Now, one thing people always talk about when discussing the Esprit is the gearbox, because this is something which held back the later cars. It's a Renault-sourced item, which I believe they also used in, I think, the Renault 25. It's a 5-speed item. It's not great. I mean, it works. So quite a long throw compared to what I'm used to, certainly in my Lotus. It's not hideous, but neither is it the gearbox that this car deserves. Now, second in particular is problematic, and I know this car just had quite a bit of money spent on it in rebuilding second. What failed? Was it the synchro failed?
Second gear, yeah.
So second gear basically failed, and that's not an unusual problem with these, because you have to remember that the amount of power that Lotus is putting through these is considerably more than the gearbox was designed for. And unfortunately, because of the way that the Esprit had been designed, and because of its basically, well, even by the time this car came out, it was a 20-year-old design, and that was 20 years ago. So in some ways, I'm driving a near 40-year-old car. They had no space to put a better gearbox in, unfortunately, and so they were stuck using this one, even in the later V8. Now, that V8 engine was capable of putting out about 500 horsepower, but they had to scale it right back to 350 just because of that gearbox. However, if you speak to Esprit aficionados, as I do on a semi-regular basis, generally it's the 4-cylinder cars which are held in the highest regard. And this one being a fairly late car, now this is put out 264 horsepower from factory. This one feels pretty strong, but the only real difference that would affect the performance is a stainless steel exhaust system. That's it. However, I do know from driving the Toyota Supra recently that with some older cars, just freeing up the exhaust flow a little bit can sometimes give you a healthy performance boost. You, that side of the road, please. Thank you. So I'm now about to get it on a slightly better, faster road, and we'll find out what the car will do, which is going to be interesting. This is a 2.2 litre charge-cooled 4-cylinder motor, and it is an evolution of the original Esprit motor. It's a Lotus designed and built unit. We clear that way?
Yeah. Good.
Oh, no, we clear this way.
Not clear this way.
No. I lost him in the A-pillar.
Yeah.
There we go.
Good blind spot. Alright, good.
So yeah, there we go. There's a hazard of the car. A massive and low A-pillar. Probably gave Charlie a scare there, but yeah, people will appear from nowhere. Does that happen to you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does. Yeah.
Sorry about that. It's like a.
That's all right. And the brakes as well are a little bit spongy, I feel. They're not too bad, but it definitely doesn't stop as quickly as the Porsche.
No. Porsche brakes tend to be very good though.
Yeah.
This car's got really, really nice Ozy wheels on. Are they originals?
Yeah, original
Yeah.
Ozys. Put on today.
It pulls quite nicely.
Yeah.
It definitely feels at least every one of the 264 brake. It's not too interested in going right to the red line. So by about 6, I think you really felt like you want to change up.
Yeah.
It's got a decent amount of mid-range shove. Response is pretty good actually. I'd say that the turbo lag is pretty much on par with it's like not massive. It's better than some modern turbocharged cars I've driven.
Yeah.
The way that Lotus designed this engine, the turbo and the engine and all the pipework, it's all very short. It's all very close together, which is great for throttle response, not so great for the longevity of the parts. So the car after this was the S4S, and that put out about 300 horsepower. Now that, along with the Sport 300, which was a limited edition version of the Esprit, and a very famous one at that, those are basically the ultimate evolutions of the 4-cylinder motor. I've seen people getting a lot more than 300 brake out of them, and you have to think that considering the age of it, it's a very, very well engineered lump. People often ask me why Lotus don't make their own engines these days, and I think the harsh reality of it is just that the amount of testing you have to go through to make an engine emissions compliant for the world is just too expensive. I'm sure they could build and design a very nice fast engine, but the cost involved in homologating it is just prohibitive, sadly. It does steer really nicely, this car. One thing that it is doing, it is shrinking around me. As I'm starting to get used to it, I'm starting to get a bit of a better feel for where the corners of the car are. That's something that happens in mid-engine cars quite a bit. The clutch pedal's very heavy, and I'm definitely not used to it. Also find it quite funny that this car has the somewhat familiar Vauxhall indicator stalks that are still in use in the Elise and the Exige some 22 years later. And one thing I think I should say for the Esprit, and really Lotus in general, people that don't know the cars tend to have this opinion of them as being really super hardcore, track-focused cars. And that reputation really comes from the Elise and the Exige. And the funny thing there is that an Elise is actually still reasonably comfortable. And so people just look at it and they see that it's got no interior, and they're quite noisy, they're definitely that. And, you know, they're not a great place to spend an awful lot of time in, but they're reasonably comfortable. So people look at something like an Esprit, and I've seen it online, just in sort of casual car things, where people talk about it as being some like hardcore track monster, and it really isn't. None of them are. They're really, really good, nice, comfy cars. I mean, by modern standards, this is much more GT car than sports car. I mean, it looks and sounds like a modern supercar or sports car. Well, it looks more than sounds, I would say. The odd thing as well with this car is that when it came out, I suspect Lotus had a very, very difficult time trying to convince people that you would spend 50 odd grand on a 4-cylinder turbocharged engine, whereas nowadays that's pretty normal. The steering's really, really nice in this. It's very, very direct. The car's suspension is set up pretty perfectly for the road. The V8 that I drove had a lower front, and they have a rubber lip on them. So if you look at them, they really ride very, very low at the front. Now that bit of rubber is kind of sacrificial, but it doesn't help when you go down a sort of bumpier road and it just goes all the time. This car's appreciably higher at the front, which just gives me that little bit more confidence to keep it going through these more uneven surfaces, which to me is what a Lotus should be good at doing. So one thing that has to be discussed when it comes to the Esprit, and it is really the elephant in the room for me when it comes to these cars, because I've come very close to Esprit ownership on a couple of occasions, and I've always backed away. One case, that's because I couldn't actually test drive the car I wanted, and I wound up buying a Z4 instead. Different, I know, but that's what happened. And then when I bought the Evora, I wanted something a bit newer with a warranty. And the thing is with an Esprit, and this is largely related to the fact that it's an old design, and they are all old cars now. I mean, the youngest Esprit on planet Earth is basically 14 years old, and it was an old design at the time. So you have to expect that maintenance is going to be needed on them, and maintenance is not going to be cheap. If you compare them with something like, say, a Ferrari of the time, that probably gives you a good idea of how much it's going to cost to keep on top of one of these things. The issue, of course, is that a classic Ferrari these days can be worth 100, 200,000 pounds. So when you get handed a $2,000 bill to do something to a car like that, owners don't generally tend to care. However, if you bought the car at £15,000, as these were only a few years ago, and you get handed a bill for £2,000 or £3,000, it's a much tougher pill to swallow. Now, this car, over the 2 years that Charlie's had it, has required a mixture of both maintenance and non-maintenance items. So it's had a new clutch on it, it's had the coolant tanks replaced, second gear had to be redone, and it's had general servicing as well. That all adds up. It's not a small figure. If you want to buy one of these and run them, I'd say probably budget about £2,000 to £3,000 a year. As with any car like this, as with all classic performance cars, if you can, try and buy one that's had a lot of the common things already done to it, stuff like the radiator on this went. But you know what? The radiator went on my Elise as well, and that cost me the best part of £2,000 by the time they'd opened it up and said, actually, while we've got the clam off, we can do this and we can do that, and oh look, these brackets have rusted a bit, let's fix that and fix that, and you know, suddenly what you thought was a £500 job is basically 1,700 quid. So this can and will happen. This isn't an exclusively Lotus thing, no matter what people might say, because the same thing will happen with a classic air-cooled 911. The same thing will happen with a classic Ferrari, just for some reason, because these cars were for a long time cheaper to buy, people don't seem to want to spend too much money on them. The good news with prices rising is that people are much more inclined to spend the money on them. which is nice. Sadly for me, it means that I'm increasingly unlikely to actually own one at any point in time. But I'm lucky enough that I can be in the position where nice people like Charlie come along and let me drive theirs, which in some ways is the best thing for me because I can look at it and listen to it, and I love it when he comes to the local meets and things because it's such a pretty looking car and quite different. You really don't see many high wings around. You have to remember the Esprit is a really, really rare car. Now, if you think about a reasonably rare car, let's take a Lamborghini. Well, a Lamborghini Gallardo, Lambo made something like 10,500, 11,000 of them. It's the most popular Lamborghini ever made. I suspect the Huracan may supersede that, but I don't think it has yet. Now, Lambo did that over a period of about 10 years of Gallardo production. Lotus made essentially the same number of Esprits over 27 years. It's not a lot of cars at all. And that's one of the reasons they're very special. And this is a great car to be enjoying these roads in. Yeah, brakes are not great. Brakes need a firm foot, let's say. Especially coming from something like an Evora or the Caterham that I've been darting around in this weekend. They're probably the element that let the car down the most. But in fairness, I would say exactly the same thing about my Subaru. Otherwise, this is a very nice, pleasant place to be. The handle's great. With that aftermarket exhaust, it actually sounds pretty good too. You find yourself getting into a rhythm with it. The steering is beautiful. Handling balance is really nice. Pedals take a bit of getting used to. And I'm definitely not used to them yet. But I'd say my first Esprit experience left me mostly nervous, actually, to be fair. This one, I'm a very happy man. So I want to say a big thank you to Charlie for bringing his car down. Please go and check out his channel because he will talk a lot on there about the realities of owning the Esprit. So if you want to know more about his issues, you know, the ups and downs of classic Lotus ownership, he'll go through all of that sort of stuff. So, you know, go and watch his channel. And I want to thank all of you that have subscribed already. If you haven't, please hit that subscribe button. It makes a really, really big difference to me and really helps me, particularly when it comes to bagsying cool cars for reviews. Like the video if you haven't already. Comment below what you think of Charlie's lovely car. Thank you guys for 2 amazing years. Here's to the next 2. Bye-bye.